How are we doing today? I trust we are doing great. Um, it's nice to see you once again. I think this would be my first session for the year, and yes, I'm glad to actually be here. Um, Today we have an interesting topic we are going to be working with or talking about today, and I'm hoping that you are able to get the understanding of this topic, and I'm sure that it promises to be interesting. Um, so, just relax, stay tuned, and then enjoy the rest of the session. I'll be proceeding to share my screen now. Just a moment. Just a moment. All right. Yeah. Just a moment. Okay. Yes. Do let me know once you are able to see my screen. All right. Today I'm going to be speaking on the designing Microsoft Azure infrastructure architect, which is the part of the is 305 programs for the year. And what we want to concentrate on today is design a non-relational data storage solution. I'm sure you must be wondering, what is a non-relational data storage solution? Well, you have nothing to worry about. You are going to have some idea about that in some few minutes. So in this session, we are we are going to generally be talking about the design for the data storage, the design for Azure storage accounts, the design for data redundancy, the design for Azure blob storage, the design for Azure files, the design for Azure disk solution, the design for storage security, and then we'll be taking a look at a case study. And like you see here, if you're actually preparing for the exam, right, this particular topic takes 25 to 30% of the questions. So this is something you don't really want to miss. This is something you don't really want to miss. All right, let's go ahead. Now, for you to design, for your design for data storage, there are some concepts we'll be looking at, right? And some of those concepts are, I will call them standard concepts, because I mean, if you are talking of data and storage in Azure, you want to know what category your data falls into. Is it structured? Is it semi-structured, or is it unstructured? These are basic classifications that you know data is used in, right? So I mean, the data you are putting in the storage account are usually grouped into this format. Now, these formats determine where you're going to store them in the storage account. All right, so um To design the Azure storage, you must first of all determine what type of data you have, which is just what I was telling you. For you to be able to design, you need to determine what type of storage you have. And here you see it says structured data includes relational data and has a shared schema, right? Whereas semi-structured data is less organized than structured data and isn't stored in a relational format. And the last but not the least is the unstructured data, which is the least organized type of data. Now, let's move on to the design for the Azure storage accounts. Now, when designing the Azure storage account, one of the things that was looked in, just like we talked about, are the types of data. Are they structured? Are they unstructured? Those are very important questions you need to consider. Now, to determine the best storage account type, you need to select an account based on the supported services, usage cases, and SLA. What do I mean by this? Each of the account types in a storage account support particular kind of services. For instance, the standard general purpose V2 account type supports the blob, data lake, queues, table, and Azure files. And in this case, it is recommended for most scenarios. So, I mean, for scenarios where you have people creating the account and doing all of that, right? You get to see them choose this account type as one which they want to work with, right? You get to see them choose this type of account as one which they want to work with. But because of it is the most, or let me say, the one which is recommended for most scenarios, people get to forget that there are actually other account types, such as the premium blobs, the premium file shares, and the premium page blobs. Now, we can see here that the premium block blobs, right, actually support blob storage and data lake. And the scenarios where this applies to are scenarios where you need high transaction rates, single digit storage latency, or large number of small transactions. So that means, for instance, if you are having to transmit some form of things through the storage account and you require a little latency, this is the storage account you should be going for, or the storage account type you should be going for, right? Now, the next one we'll be looking at is the premium file shares. It's called the premium file shares for a particular reason. And one of such reasons is due to the fact of the size of the files which you can have in there. For the premium file shares, right, mostly the service supported here is the Azure files, right? Just like you have your file share in your organizations where you keep files that maybe one or more departments make use of. That's where the Azure file share is coming from. But this time around, it's called premium because of the amount or the size of files which can be stored in this file share. And then you can see usage examples or usage scenarios are what we call the enterprise or high performance scale applications, which supports both SMB and NFS file shares. I remember in some days when I used to work with a client and they needed to do some NFS configurations. Most of the time, that happens with your Linux instances. But for Windows, you have the SMB. So the premium file share is an account type that can actually be used and considered when you want to determine how you can design your storage account. And then last but not the least for now is the premium page blobs. The premium page blobs, right? They support the page blobs only. They support the page blobs only. And you have in these scenarios where they are mostly used when high performance and low latency storage scenarios are needed. Now, you can clearly see that most of the premium services actually give us low latency. That is actually one of the reasons why these services are created. Because I mean, if you're paying for a premium service, you want to ensure that you are actually getting the value for which you are paying for. I mean, you don't want to be doing streaming some things through your storage account and then you find out that you're experiencing high latency. I am guessing that you would not be happy with that. So for the premium block blobs, the premium file shares, the premium page blobs, what you would notice is that these services have low latency. Moving ahead, now, when you are designing for your storage account, you want to consider the location and some other factors where this plan is going to be holding. Some of these factors you need to consider: one, the location, the compliance, in terms of both local regulatory policies and international regulatory policies. You also want to consider the cost. What does it cost you to run this storage account? The replication strategy, and the administrative overhead and your data sensitivity. So these are 6 factors that you want to consider when talking about or when planning for your storage account. Now, for the location, you says here, for best performance reasons, locate the data close to users. One storage account for each location. So this clearly tells you that, look, if you are looking for the best performance, you should be looking for something close to you. Yeah, you should be looking for something close to you. Now, when you talk of compliance, we all know that data in some countries, some kind of data are required to obey some regulatory laws within the country, right? So, just for instance, take an example where you have banks who have some customer information, and right, they need to make use of Azure services. And sometimes regulatory policies will tell you that, look, if you are holding customer data of this kind, ensure they don't leave the region where the bank is. So that means you need to look for a storage account that has a data center in the region where you are based. So this is what we talk of when we talk of compliance: regulatory guidelines for keeping data in a specific location, or internal requirements for auditing or storing data. Now, you can't talk about planning without costing. In fact, I'm not sure you'll be able to go far with your planning if you aren't considering costing, right? Now, for costing, the settings for the account do influence the cost of service in the account. What does this mean? Take, for instance, that I decide to make use of a premium service. Of course, the cost is going to be higher than making use of a standard service. Also, if you, in your configuration, whilst configuring the storage account, you add some extra features, it is also what's the word? It is also important to know that those extra features which you're adding also would incur costs, right? So that's why it says here that the settings for the account does influence the cost of the services in the storage account. Now, the next thing to look at is what? Replication. Of course, replication is very, very important. Why? Because you want a scenario where you can be able to I won't use the word backup, but you are able to replicate your data across maybe availability zones for availability's sake. So you can see here it says data storage could have different replication strategies. Now, talking of the next one, which is the administrative overhead, you will see that each storage account requires some time and attention from an administrator to create and maintain. So, yes, the storage account is being created, but of course, you require somebody who is going to maintain it. If the Let's say if the SAS key expires for some reason, you require somebody who is going to refresh that key or create a new key. These are things that needs to be considered. Also, for data sensitivity, you want to ensure that your data plane security and data security, storage security are always intact. Why? Because this is data we are talking about. You always want to ensure that your security are always intact. Design for data redundancy. I mean, design for data redundancy tells us what the design really is about. But here, you ask yourself, what level of redundancy do you really need? What level of redundancy do you really need? Now, for the primary region, we have two basic kind of replication strategy, which is the locally redundant storage and the zone redundant storage. Yeah, the locally redundant storage and the zone redundant storage. I mean, that is something you always want to be sure you are aware about, right? So when considering the um, primary region, these are two key things you need to put into perspective. And for your secondary region, you're talking of the geo-redundant storage and the geo-zone redundant storage. Excuse me for a minute. Now, one of the things you need to take into consideration is the fact that read and write access to the secondary region are available if the primary region becomes unavailable. For any instance or in any scenario or in a situation where the primary region becomes unavailable, you have the secondary region coming into place and then acting as the primary region. This is very important thing you have to put into consideration as well, right? Also, you need to know that a node within a data center, for instance, let's say a node within the data center becomes available, or an entire data center, zonal or non-zonal, becomes available, or a region-wide outage occurs in the primary region. Your secondary region automatically takes the place of the primary region, right? And then you are able to read and write into this secondary region. Isn't that beautiful? So this is the more reason why you need to have a plan for your storage replication strategy. You need to have a strategy that is always going to work for you. Now, design for Azure Blob storage, right? Now, before I go ahead, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to, put on the chat screen, on the message button, and of course, we are going to provide answers to those questions. Now, one of the things you want to do, right, while working or planning towards how you want to do an architect of your storage account is to determine the storage tier. You want to be able to ensure that you determine this because it has various effects on not just the costing but other aspects as well. So for your blob storage, this is an object store used for storing vast amounts of unstructured data, right? And then when you're talking about the storage tier, there are four basic kind of storage tier we currently have available in Azure, which is the premium, the standard hot, the standard cool, and then the standard archive. Now, each of these provide a means of costing. And by means of costing, I'm referring to what it will cost you to configure this tier in your environment. So, for instance, the storage cost you are looking at when you are doing a premium tier is going to be absolutely high, right? And then when you are talking of a standard hot tier, you are looking at a medium storage cost. And the reason why people would actually go for premium is scenarios where you need, oh, you need like constant access to the data, you need to be able to query the data and do a lot of things as regarding the data. Of course, you actually would benefit by making use of the premium tier. But for instances like the standard hot, which has a medium cost, right? You will see that yes, you are able to be active and frequently use the storage account, but this is not as frequent as when you have the premium tier. So this is something you also need to look into. Right. Now, the next one which we talked about, which is the standard cool, it has a low storage cost, right? And a medium retrieval read cost, right? And then this data can be stored for what? Greater than 30 days. You will notice something that for the premium and the standard hot, there is no duration to which the data itself can be stored. None. But for the standard cool, you have the what? The 30 days or above or greater than 30 days. Right? Same thing happens for the standard archive, which is, has a very high retrieval cost, but then the storage duration is usually 100 and over 180 days. Right? Which is, if you take a look at this is let me say almost let me see, we have 30 days in a month, right? So this is like almost 6 months. I mean, what is there not to benefit from? Please give me a minute. Let me take some water. Now, one of the things you also want to consider is the life cycle rules to transition the blob data to the appropriate access tiers. And also consider a data lifecycle rule to expire or delete. Right? These are the things you need to look at when you're considering making use of, a blob storage. Now, immutable storage policies. I'm sure you must be wondering, why should a storage policy be immutable? Why? So this helps to determine regulatory compliance, secure document retention, and also legally hold policies. And you can see here, while considering the immutable storage policies, you need to look at how to apply the immutable storage policies at the storage account level, use time-based retention policies for business critical data, use legal hold policies for sensitive information to ensure a tamper-proof what state. And then you then have policies apply only to what? A new account. Policies apply to only new accounts. And then finally, audit logs are available. All right. So now, taking a look at this diagram here to our right, we see scenarios where we see the container and then the various blobs contained in the container. And you can see here the locked time-based retention policy is is taking an effect here. Whereas in the second one, you have the legal hold, right? And then you have inside the container virtually the same amount of blobs you have in your log time based retention policy container. All right, let's move ahead. Design for Azure files. What is the actual design for Azure files, right? At this point, I would like to call on the moderator. Catherine, I don't know if there are any questions available. Are there any questions being asked so far? Hello, Catherine. Are there any questions being asked so far? All right. I would consider her silence to be none at the moment. Right? Okay. So let's proceed. Right? And now it says compare Azure files to what? Azure blobs. Compare Azure files to what? Azure blobs. Now, one of the things you want to know when comparing Azure files to Azure blobs is the what word would I use? The way at which each is moved, right? The way at which you use each one, the Azure files, the Azure blobs, the way at which they use is what actually differentiates the two of them. All right. So in use case scenario here, you can see for the Azure files, you can replace or supplement the traditional on-premises file servers on NAS devices, right? And for the Azure Blob Storage, you have large-scale analytical data. Also, you are able to, for the Azure files, you're able to access the file share from anywhere in the world. From anywhere in the world, you are able to access the file share. For Azure Blob Storage, right, the throughput sensitive high performance computing is something you are always going to witness when making use of this. And then you can see here it says one of the easy or special things that make the Azure files very interesting is the ability to lift, right, and shift content to the cloud. That ability alone solves that issue. Right. So here you can also see that for the Azure Blob Storage, you have what? Backup and archive. These are options that are provided for you when making use of the Azure Blob Storage. And then here you have replication and cache with Azure File Sync. I mean, Azure File Sync helps you to replicate, and then you are able to sync your data across multiple devices in the cloud, right? So, I mean, that's one interesting feature, right? And then we also have the autonomous driving, media rendering, or what? Genomic sequencing data, right? So now you can see the use case scenarios between the Azure files and then the Azure what? Blob storage. Also, the available protocols in the Azure files are a bit different from the available protocols um, in the protocols are a bit different from what you have between the Azure files and the Azure Blob Storage. And some of such protocols are the REST protocol, the SMB protocol, and the NFS 4.1 protocol. Whereas in the Azure Blob Storage, you have the NFS 3.0 protocol, the REST protocol, and the data lake storage account. You say the data lake storage generation 2. And then you can see here it says in terms of the performance, you have what? A better IOPS. But when if you're using making of Azure Blob Storage, you're actually having a better what? Throughput. You're having a what? A better throughput. Now it says here, select a file storage tier or what? Activity. Now you need to tailor your file tier to the performance and the price you need. This is very important before you start your project, because you want to be able to, come up with a costing that is going to be made use of this pipeline. Or you want to be able to have an idea of the costing that it will take you, to configure this kind of storage account. Now, for the file storage, we also have the TS2 available, which is the premium, the transaction optimized, the hot, and the cold. And also, if you remember, we had um the tiers for what? The Azure storage. But this time around, if you remember, for the Azure storage, I remember we talked about the tiers being the standard, which supports, some kind of services. Then we have the premium, right? And then we also have the hot and the cool. And remember, we talked about how these various tiers affect the pricing. For in this case now, the premium, of course, you would have little latency, but then you're going to be talking of more costs. Also, you have the transaction being optimized in in that the transaction optimized here. You have you have like, what's the word, that particular tier processing data at a fast rate for you. And also, you're going to be getting a very low what's the word to make use of, a very low latency. But then here you also have, for these file storage tiers, the hot and the cool. The hot denotes instances where you want to be able to run, you want to be able to have access to your files or what you've stored there at every interval possible. And also, these are files that, the kind of files you store there are files you easily access. Whereas the cool might take some time for you to be able to what, you know, it might take some time for you to be able to process the data, but then it has a very high data retention period. Now, moving ahead, you can see here the design for what? Apps, net app files. Now, you might be asking yourself, what are net app files, right? Net app files, this is just basically like an application file. You can see here it says the Azure NetApp file service is enterprise class, high performance, and metered file storage. Right? Now, when designing this NetApp files, one of the things you need to put into consideration, right, is the ease of migration, the workload scale, the flexibility, and what? The storage account or the storage technology. So here, in terms of ease of migration, you're looking at migration from Windows apps to SQL Server to Linux OSS apps and databases. Also, you're looking at, in terms of workload scale, you're looking at what the specialized workloads, HPC, VDI, AVS. And then for flexibility, you are looking at what? The Azure Platform Services, AKS, and Azure Badge, and also other services that fall into that. And then for the storage technology, you are also making use of the, what would I call it in this case, for the storage technology, you are also making use of scenarios that would help to increase the transaction amount or the transaction value, right? So here you can see here that one, the migration is for the Windows apps, the SQL Server, the Linux OSS apps and databases, and then you have specialized SQL or specialized workloads. And here I advise that you start the process of what's the word? Let me put it. One of the things you need to also consider here is the fact that when you're making use of these services, you get a high performance value, right? And you also want to ensure that you're flexible, meaning you can make use of other services along with this. So you can see here it says Azure Platform Service AKS and the Azure Batch, which are few services that can be, used with the net app files, right? And then for the storage technology, you're looking at what? Azure net app files. All right, let's move ahead. You need to talk about the design for the Azure Disk solution. And in here, we'll be bringing out some very important factors of the Azure Disk. Before I proceed, I would like to ask, does anyone have any question, any means or thing you would like to clarify on? Please, please, please don't hesitate to share. In fact, both of us can brainstorm to find the answers to the question you're asking. All right, so we say here, select an Azure Disk solution, right? And one of the things you want to consider here, right, are the block level storage volumes used with what? Azure virtual machines. Those are one of the things you want to consider, right? And then here you see you need to consider what? The disk type, the scenario, the throughput, and the IOPS value. I remember back then when I was actually doing some support work, and I would have customers come in and say, "Oh, I don't think this disk that Microsoft has given me is actually giving the value for which I paid for." Right? And then one of the things I would do is to enlighten them more on how to actually make use of, or how to understand how these parameters are being allocated to the storage account, right? So here, you are not just looking at considering the disk type, scenarios, throughput, and IOPS values, but you're also looking at, wait, are we using a managed disk or is it a non-managed disk? Now, for a long time, for a while now, Azure has brought the concept of using the managed disk rather than the unmanaged disk, because that's where, for the unmanaged disk, you have to, run some commands which might actually get you some get you making use of PowerShell scripts and all of that when you want to make use of the what's the word called, unmanaged disk. Now also you need to consider how to optimize the read and write access with caching. Also make use of the Azure disk encryption, and then enhance performance with multiple disk. Use the network acceleration feature which is present to actually get the network value. And better still, last but not the least, you want to be able to share disk across multiple virtual machines. Across multiple virtual machines. All right. Now, some of the disk types you would have, right, when choosing your managed disk is one, the ultra disk SSD. One of the things you need to know for the ultra disk SSD is that the IO intensive workloads such as SAP HANA, top tier databases, SQL, Oracle, and other transactions, right? Heavy workloads. So this ultra disk SSD deals with what? Very, very high number of workloads at a faster rate. Also, you have the premium SSD V2, the premium SSD, standard HD SSD, and the standard what? HDD. Now let's see how we to design the storage account, right? Let's see how to design the storage account and consider considerations for what? The security of the storage account. All right, so here you see it makes mentions of use a layered security model to secure and control what? Access. To secure and protect access. Right? So one of the things you want to consider here what are your firewall policies. Do they enable secure transfer? What kind of keys do you have? Right? And also you have here service endpoint, private endpoints. So these are the endpoints you can actually make use of when considering the the kind of storage account you want to make use of. Also, when considering this, you need to be able to grant limited access to the storage account, right? And then you need to be able to enable the firewall rules to limit access to that IP. And then and then for the third one, you use private endpoints and private links for clients, right? Now, you also need to use the virtual network service and private link for the client, right? And then lastly, use customer managed encryption keys. Lastly, use customer managed encryption keys. So, I mean, that is some of the concepts you also need to look at when designing or when working with your storage accounts. Moving ahead, right? Um, okay, let's go forward and come back to the case study review. All right. So, one of the things you want to consider here for your case study review is one, what files are you bringing in, right? What kind of files are you bringing to the storage account? And then here you can see here it says media files, one, which are product photos and features. JPEG and MP4 are most common what formats. But then you have other formats just like the marketing literature here. So in this case, right, for the marketing literature, you are talking about the, let's say, customer stories, sales flyers, sizing charts, and eco-friendly manufacturing information. And then you have here the PDF format is the most common. And then for the corporate document, you have what? The internal document, some sensitive while some not. Well, and you now have mostly office formats like Word and Excel. So here under the non-relational database, we are looking at the media files, the marketing iteration, and then the corporate documents. All right. Okay, so let's look at this case study and see what to make of it. Now, here you want to design a storage solution for what? The tailwind traders. What type of data is represented? Remember, when we started this lecture, we talked about the various kinds of data, the structured, the unstructured, right? And the semi-structured. So that's the question you want to ask yourself. The data you have, what category is it in? Is it under the structured, the semi-structured, or the unstructured? And also you need to consider what factors will you consider in your design. What factors do you consider in your design? Are you all about reducing the cost and then you sacrifice the performance of the storage account because of the cost or because of the cost? So those are some of the things you also need to look into. But here we have what factors will you consider in your design? What factors would you consider in your design? And then you can also have what type of storage accounts are needed. So this is how you are able to process you know, the solution faster. All right. Now you also have here, will you use blob access tiers or not? Right? Will you also use immutable storage or not? Right? Will you will how will the content be securely accessed? Right? So those are things you really need to take a you really need to take into consideration when actually designing your storage account. All right, so let's move ahead. Here in this diagram, you can see here a simple design solution, right, for the storage account. And in here, you can see, let me make use of this. You can see in here the internet, right, is connected what to the application gateway. There are actually some configurations you will need to actually ensure that this works as expected. And then from the application gateway, you then have a what? An app service before it is then pushed, into the what? The storage account. Before it is then pushed into the storage account. And then in the storage account, you have the blob access, the Azure files, and the access tiers. Same thing here applies for what kind of data you're pushing into from the internet into your storage account. So these things you would need to be able to understand them to have an idea on how to configure the storage account. So at this time, I would just like to ask, what are your questions regarding the topic for today? What are your questions regarding the topic for today? Hello, Catherine, are you there? Hello, Catherine. Hello, Catherine, are you there? All right. So, um, I'm going to be checking the chat now to see if we have any questions for today. Yes. All right. All right. All right. Checking the chats. Okay. Okay. So currently, I see that we do not have any questions for today. I see that we do not have any questions for today. But I mean, I'm just hoping and I'm hoping you were able to gain something from the lecture for today. So at this point, if there are no questions for today, um, I'd like to ask you: are you aware of the programs we have for next week? Have you joined our channels? Have you subscribed to the YouTube channel? If you haven't, please do ensure you subscribe and follow our pages for the programs we are going to be having for this year. All right. Catherine, are you there?
For your
Oh,
time. We really enjoyed your session. Thank you for taking
all
us
right.
through.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Hi, our audience. I hope you actually enjoyed Promise taking us through designing a non-relational storage solution. We hope to see you guys next week for another topic.